Awesome. Okay, so welcome everyone to session 9.1, Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals Award Winners Circle. I'm Chris Uchiyama, the current president of CAHP, and I'll be your moderator today, but I'm also joined by the co-chairs of the awards committee, Michael Scott and Craig Wadsworth. As I was saying, feel free, leave your cameras on, wave, smile. Later on in the session, everyone will get a chance to participate through voice and chat. So it's great to see everyone's face as we're going through this whole presentation. I'd like to begin the session by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands and territories that we're on today. I'm joining this virtual event from the traditional ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat, on land that's covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And we recognize that participants in this session live and work on many lands and territories of Indigenous peoples across Canada. And we encourage you to join us in reflecting upon histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, past and present, whose presence continues to enrich our shared heritage. And while this is always the case, it's especially important to reflect on this today when many of us are observing a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So each year, CAHP presents our annual awards to celebrate outstanding achievement in the heritage field across Canada. And this year we awarded more than 40 individual CAHP members who participated in 12 award-winning projects. Our annual award recipients were just announced this Monday, and it's regretful that once again, we're not able to hold a formal in-person award ceremony to celebrate all of our winners, but we were able to build this session into the conference program. So we're not able to handle the logistics of more than 40 people presenting on their projects within the confines of one session. So we've asked a range of all the different categories to represent and do brief presentations on the podium. And then we'll open things up for a Q&A and more of a discussion towards the end of the session. So joining us on the panel today are Jason Grossi, Principal of Studio G+G, Inc. Architect. He's the designer and heritage architect on site for the John Muir Branch, Windsor Public Library project. Jonathan D. is joining us from John G. Cook and Associates. He's the conservation structural engineer for the Fort Mississauga Tower Stabilization Project. Ellen Kowalchuk, partner at Common Bond Collective, is joining us. She is the project manager and historian for the Oakville Harbor Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy Implementation Project. Say that 5 times fast. Stephanie Ma's joining us, along with Ria Alameen from JIMO, and they were project members for the Brighter Days Ahead project. And Luke McElprin is a whose Masters of Architecture thesis, Vital Traditions, Assessing the Status of Skilled Trades Work in Toronto's Heritage Policy, won the Student Achievement Award this year. And we're also joined by Sarah Gray, who was one of this year's jurors. In a few moments, we'll be hearing from each of the panelists about their projects, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. But first, I'm going to try through the magic of technology to share a short slideshow with all of our award-winning projects. Fingers crossed that this works. Congratulations, everyone. Félicitations. It's always great to see what a wide range of projects our members are working on. And we'll have another opportunity to go through all the presentations again at the upcoming AGM, and we'll be posting more information on the website so you can look into the projects in more detail. Okay, so to begin our panel presentations, I'd like to invite Jason Grossi to discuss the John Muir Branch Windsor Public Library project. Jason?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me try and share this. Okay, here we go. Let's see if it'll do it. Okay, is that on there? It's good? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It's really great to be part of this with all the winners that I just saw. It's extremely impressive. So I would have to say on behalf of the City of Windsor, because this project is a City of Windsor project in the Windsor Public Library, and this is as a community of people of Sandwich and our team, our project team, we're really thrilled that we received some recognition for this work, for our efforts really to just preserve a place within our community. The John Muir branch of the Windsor Public Library is really, first of all, the revitalization of a historic place. It's also the revitalization of a fire hall that was built in, let's see, I think these are advancing or not. Yeah, there, is that working? Okay, great, thank you. It's also the revitalization of a fire hall that was built in 1921, and the rehabilitation of a stable structure, probably one of the oldest stable structures we have in our city from the mid-19th century. It's on a very narrow site, so it's very hard to really perceive the full totality of the project. It's not a large project, but it's fairly comprehensive. So from the side is really the only way to really view the collection of the two buildings, the stable on the left and the fire hall on the right, and the difficulty of really combining these projects into one library project with a contemporary structure. It was agreed right at the beginning of the outset of the project that we would be restoring the heritage buildings to their original time, and then merging them together in a contemporary piece that would use a language that would resonate with both buildings. So it is kind of difficult to really piece together from the street facade what it is, because from the street facade, you really only see the 1921 fire hall. But as I said from the beginning, we understood this to be more important about the reactualization of a historic place first, then the revitalization of two historic buildings, because this site, as far as we know, it's the first structure on this site was built in 1838, which was the first Methodist church that you can see here. And then in 1878, it was purchased by the town of Sandwich and became a kind of a mixed bag of things. It was a schoolhouse, it was council chambers, and then a fire hall. And from that point on, it remained a fire hall, being replaced in 1921 by the structure you see here, and continuing until 1960, at which point the site was abandoned. The fire hall that you see here in 21 actually underwent a fire, funny enough, in 1945. And that really decimated the second floor. So its appearance changed. But prior to that, this site always had some sort of a vertical beacon that was, seen anywhere in the town. And at some point, we assume from 1945, we don't have hard evidence of that, but it was gone prior to the fire. That was removed. So the belfry was gone, and that sort of vertical emphasis was gone. So really the goal of the project was to reinvigorate this historic site, which had been really a blight in the town of Sandwich since the 60s. It had been used, this is prior to the work, obviously. It was really used from the 60s and on as a kind of a dumping ground for public works. So the whole intent was to try and unify these disparate buildings, bring them back to their significance, turn them into a library, and deal with all the other challenges that we had to, from accessibility, putting in a new elevator with soils that were really unstable, We had monitoring the whole time to do that. Brownfield site. The Windsor Heritage Committee had imposed, and I think justifiably so, a height restriction that wouldn't exceed the height of the stable. So there were a number of challenges on how to do this. And from the design standpoint, the biggest challenge was how do you fuse these two buildings at very different time periods and materials together. And after much deliberation, this is one of the sketches that resulted. You can see this is from our archival documentation, so you can see that this isn't the building as it is now, but as it was when we documented the site as perhaps. I don't know if everyone's aware of that, but what the intent here was to try and extend both buildings into the chasm of space, to try and pull the fire hall in one direction and then the stable in the other direction. So the logic here was to try and pull the masonry forward into the site, deal with the monochromatic scheme of the stucco, and then from the fire hall standpoint, or from the stable standpoint, to try and pull that polygonal geometry and sort of extrude it into that chasm. And that's what gave us this geometry of this light-filled space at the top. As you can see here in the section, here's the stable and the fire hall, and connect the two via this bridge that would actually act as a sort of a light baffle for the collections below. So it was trying to find a language which was idiomatic to the two buildings that could sort of materialize into a new structure. The other challenge was, of course, prominence, because this building was very prominent, the fire hall, and the stable sort of receded. And so the geometry of the building, as he sort of bounces toward the stable to try and allow these buildings to speak without any sort of a dominant element. That was really, it was a kind of this balance all the way through. And I don't know if anyone knows Windsor, but Windsor is sort of new to actually caring about heritage buildings. Unfortunately, we've decimated much of our heritage stock. And so this was a significant municipal project, and the decision was made from the very beginning to make this a didactic project. This is the one time we were not going to hire trades from out of town to do it. And we were going to allow ourselves to teach, and we agreed to do it, is to teach the local trades how to do things. So from repointing masonry, but also doing a pebbled mortar technique, which hadn't been done here before, and collaborating with our carpenters in the local college and actually teaching them how to make the windows. So it was myself and another architect that were literally there training them how to do it by hand, the same way it was done. So this project had projects within projects. One of those was the tower itself. As I said, there was no vertical sort of marker or statement anymore in Sandwich. And it was really a desire from everybody in the town to bring that back in some new way. Obviously, it wasn't sound, but in this case, it was light. And we have a kind of a tower within a tower project. The existing masonry being very stiff couldn't handle putting something on top of it. Otherwise, it would have to handle the same sort of stress, the wind load and such, and couldn't handle it. So the solution was really a sleeved tower within another one. So this, as you can see, being distended down, sitting on its own foundation system, coming within 1.5 inches of the structure, and sits on helical piles that go down close to 100 feet. And they got their light candy that they wanted for the town. The interior, this is what materialized: a very open, interconnected space, light filled, where from a security standpoint, everybody can see everybody, but it also becomes a kind of a gathering place for everybody. This space is often used for performances. Inside the addition, we have that one piece of the library that can identify as a place for books. We did it in the children's area, so it would be whimsical and fun, where the books became a sort of a screen where light could come through. And this is the sort of effect in the old fire hall. As I said, it burned to the ground in the upper floor. We were able to preserve one of the charred timbers that was hidden inside the building and expose it. Now, since it's been completed, it's really been well received. It's probably the most visited, prior to the pandemic, of course, probably the most visited library within our library system. It opened with over 300 visitors, but since we had the fire guys there, they said it was okay that we exceeded the occupancy. And since then, we've had, prior to pandemic, well over 200 visitors per day at this library. And it's, this fun place that people can run around, especially the bridge, right? Kids love to run down the bridge. And it's a great place for performances. So we've taken a building and we're very proud of it. We've taken basically something that we were really not proud of, and the fact that we hadn't done something. And the city has made a statement that this is a different page turn, and heritage is going to be of significance for us from now on. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason.
I hope that was under the time.
Perfect. Thanks. Great timing. Next, I'd like to invite Jonathan D to discuss the Fort Mississauga's tower stabilization project.
Hi, thanks, Chris. I'll share my screen as well here. I'll try to be brief and go through just some photographs and some just the overall sequence that we went through with this project. Let me just, here we go. So in terms of some context, this is a fort. I believe it's the only remaining star-shaped earthworks fortification from the War of 1812 that exists in Canada. So it was built, I think, in 1814, and it's right across the river from Fort Niagara on the American side, right at the mouth of the Niagara River, where it meets Lake Ontario. So Fort George is nearby, and it's the more the site that's much more well known to people and frequented by tourists. And this happens to be in the middle of a golf course, not very visible or accessible from the street, but it's all quite original to, it's a lot of the original materials are still there, and it's a very interesting site. This is the way it was when we found it a few years ago. You can see it actually has been reclad, and they've put on parging in the past. It's been reclad with brick, we believe, in the 20s or 30s. And this actually was an active military site, I believe, it certainly through World War I, and I think including World War II, where it was a parade grounds for the Canadian military. So it was really fairly neglected, unheated, no windows, and exposed to the elements, and a little bit forgotten about. The roof was in very poor shape. And as you can see, the upper, the corners and the upper courses of the brick masonry were in fairly poor condition. I don't know if you can, no, that's not the corner. So there's the picture of the roof. So there's not a single tab left on these shingles. And the tops of the walls, it's hard to see in the photographs, but these are 7 feet thick brick with rubble, stone rubble core, and all exposed at the top. So there was a back slope on the parapet away from the top of the walls, and to some drains that then went through the wall, and they always froze up in the winter, and all the water was basically being poured into the masonry inside the walls. So I remember being in there to do some investigation, and it had rained the day before, and it was still raining inside the building the next morning. So hard to get images in there since there was no light initially, but it's a fairly interesting space where from the inside, you just see there are 2 brick arched chambers, and the plaster is still hanging on in some locations. But in others, the masonry is fairly badly deteriorated due to freeze thaw. This would be one example of that along one wall where about 8 inches of brick is no longer in good shape. There you can really see it where it slopes back away from the scaffolding. So in fairly poor condition. And we were actually a sub-consultant brought in, but our initial goal was to value engineer a shoring system. So there was a previous consultant, I believe 2 previous consultant teams that had gone through here, and the intent was to effectively shore the entire building. And you can see this is all wood lagging on new shoring systems on concrete footings, steel framing. So quite an extensive shoring system was proposed to go in there. And our stated goal was to value engineer that shoring. But we started out with doing some investigation, so we didn't know based on the previous reports, things like the thickness of the arch or what kind of shape, what kind of condition the arch was in, the arches were in, since there's 2 of them. And so we did some investigation at first, setting up scaffolding for some investigatory openings to get an idea of the composition of the walls. Interestingly, there was a lighthouse on this site prior to the War of 1812, and it was the first lighthouse on the Great Lakes. And they believed that the materials from the lighthouse, which was stone masonry, were actually incorporated into the fort. And it is a rubble stone core, so quite possible. We ended up, since we did not know the thickness of the arches, we cored it in a few locations, strategic locations, to get an idea of not only of the thickness, but also the composition. Here over at the haunch of the arch, we wanted to see where we're going to come across a consistent top level for that arch, where the haunch is filled with brick or where they filled with loose material. And we also excavated to the tops of the arch from above in the attic space after the archaeological team had cleared it for doing that, since the floor in this space and the gun deck above are both archaeological areas or sensitive areas. So there's some more images coring right at the crown of the arch. And then I'll just go through this. These are our, actually, well, this is a good one. So you can see varying whites of brick thick to a rubble core, and that ranged from 1 brick thick to 4. And then we effectively, having determined this, here's an image of the core. This one didn't hold up so well. Others were better. But having determined the overall thickness, we were now comfortable proceeding with an analysis of the arch to see just how much it needed to be shored. And back calculating the previous design, we were able to see that they were effectively thinking they needed to shore for the entire weight. And it does look quite bad from inside, but you can see, looking up the core holes, there's quite a bit of intact masonry. You know, there's some lines, but where it's debonded, but overall, not in too terrible a shape. So this is our test pit in the attic. So anyway, from that, we did test the mortar, we did test the brick materials as well. We did a petrographic analysis on the mortar to see what the components were. And then we moved on to analyze the arch. So I don't know. I mean, in my career, I haven't done this a whole lot, simply because usually arches are not, you're not using arches all that frequently as a structural, certainly not in new construction, but even trying to rely on them in historic construction, you know, it's a little bit, it's not that common that something you do all that frequently, at least in my experience. But in this case, we were hoping to, you know, we've done a few of these, but in this case, we were hoping to really rely on this arch and minimize how much shoring we had to put in. So what we ultimately did is we got a 3D laser scanning of the, we had 3D laser scanning done of the interior and exterior of the tower. And then using slices of that scan, we got the profile of the arches, and we were able to estimate how much material had been lost. And then based on our investigations, an additional amount of material that we thought was fairly compromised and we didn't want to rely on. And then we, from there, completed an analysis. We did this a couple ways. With arches, you know, given the size of the buildings, usually arches don't fail in compression or anything like that, where material is crushing. It tends to fail because you can't pass a line of compression within the arch. So you end up developing bending and tension forces in the arch somewhere, and then another hinge develops, and then that's when the arch will fail. So there's a great book actually written by Jacques Hyman, I think his name is, and it's The Stone Skeleton, a very good resource if you're ever looking at arches. But essentially what we did is we modeled thrust lines. We made models of the arch of the profile in using segments, beam segments, in analysis software. And then we looked at various end conditions, whether fixed or pinned or, all kinds of releases. And we tried, to make sure we were covering the various boundary conditions that we felt might exist. And then effectively, we just tried to draw, knowing the loading on top of the arches, we tried to draw thrust lines within the arch, or we saw where thrust lines would be based on the end conditions. And so all this really is the line of compression is up here in the red relative to the central axis of the arch of the depth of the profile. And that difference in height gives you some eccentricity, which gets you bending resistance, if you want to look at it as if it were a beam. So so that's essentially what we did. And then knowing how much material we thought might be missing or compromised, we then calculated a factor of safety, which is what you see here. GFS meaning geometric factor of safety, and geometric factor of safety less than 200, meaning with 200 millimeters of less material. And so finally, having done that, some areas we elected to rebuild that were quite bad, and then other areas just very localized rebuilding of the arches, and then other areas we scaled just to try to mitigate the risk of falling debris within the space. But we effectively reduced the amount of shoring to zero, and we got that budget, which was considerable for shoring, reallocated to masonry to suit a new roof that was going to go on the building. So all this masonry was not originally included, and we reallocated all that shoring budget to do this work, which was quite complementary to the new roof, which would go on just above it to make sure that it was sitting on a good, the material that would no longer be accessible was now in fairly good condition. So these are just some progress photos. You can see the old roof was completely removed. A lot of the walls were removed down. We exposed the core. The coping was gone. We rebuilt that. This is the attic floor, which was then fully exposed following the removal of the original roof. That fireplace there is actually a hot shot fireplace. They would apparently heat up cannonballs to be red hot before they'd fire them at enemy ships. Yes, this was the new roof. GRC were the architects on this. S&C Lavalin were the prime consultants. And this roof now has an overhang. That's all pre-engineered wood trusses. This is the new stone coping or brick coping, now no longer exposed to the elements. Here's an overall progress shot during construction. The upper courses of brick, as I mentioned, were in fairly bad shape. They were all either rebuilt with new brick or removed and reset. And often some of the salvaged brick was reset down, saved and reset down on these lower courses. And the corners as well. So the corners suffered from previous drain holes through them where water was just pouring out through the masonry. So they were generally in poor condition as well. And that's it. So the site there's 2 magazines on either side. Over here on the bottom right is a sally port, which has now been blocked off. Oh yeah, I just wanted to share this too. This is cool. In the sally port, so this is the sally port, which has now been blocked off, but it's not in great shape either. This site could use a bit more attention, but it is full of old soldiers back in the day, would carve their names into the brick. And 1939, 1880, some of them had, I guess, a lot of time to do this. And it's very neat, very cool site. I encourage you, if you're ever in the area, Niagara-on-the-Lake, to go and visit. It's quite an interesting spot, and I enjoyed working there. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to ask Ellen Kowalczyk now to discuss the Oakville Harbor Cultural Heritage Landscape Strategy Implementation Project. It's the longest title ever.
I know. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Kowalczyk. I'm a partner at Common Bond Collective, and we were the lead consultants for the Oakville Harbor Cultural Landscape Project. We were joined by Timmins Martell, who did the engagements component for us, as well as a land use planner, Sean Hertel, and then a natural landscape consultant, Mark Laird, who was really invaluable in the project and in talking to us about the importance of biodiversity in the area. So the long title is a result of the a larger initiative that the town of Oakville has around cultural landscapes. And for a number of years now, they have been identifying potential landscapes, evaluating them, designating them under the Ontario Heritage Act, and creating conservation plans for them. So they're really, really leaders, I think, in this field in Ontario. And we are very happy to be working on this project for them. So cultural landscapes might not all be familiar with definitions or what they are. In Ontario, we do define cultural landscapes. The provincial policy statement does talk about them as defined geographical areas that have been identified as having value to communities, particularly Indigenous communities. But there's other ways that are not so quite operational to think about cultural landscapes, which are to think about places where there are ideas and practices embedded in a place. So cultural landscape approach to places is really about understanding how the environment has shaped us and our use and our activity, but also how how human beings have shaped our environment. And so they have, I think, a very good potential to understand places in a different way than we typically do with heritage planning, which is often, maybe a building on its footprint or a property. And we think it's interesting at this particular junction of where we are in the history of Canada, the approach of cultural landscapes and the possibility they bring, particularly because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their calls to action. And there's a specific one, Action 79, that talks about integrating Indigenous history, heritage values, and memory practices into Canada's national heritage and history. And it's important, I think, that we not only recognize Indigenous history, but also to recognize that a lot of that history is quite painful and difficult and has caused harm. And we need to understand that history and then also be able to undertake concrete actions to change attitudes and behavior. And I think another thing that cultural landscapes can potentially do is help us understand that places have different meanings for different communities, and that these meanings often contradict each other. They can really stand in opposition to each other, but beginning to untangle that knot of what it means for different communities, I think potentially, and I hope potentially, as we continue to work with cultural landscapes across Ontario and Canada, helps us understand places differently. So one of the things I just wanted to highlight in my talk here is one of the things I really am grateful for learning from this project was the opportunity to engage and learn from the Mississaugas of the Credit, whose territory the Oakville Harbor was traditionally. So Oakville Harbor is the intersection of 16 Mile Creek and Lake Ontario in the town of Oakville. And that was a place of, first of all, great spiritual significance for the Mississaugas, particularly not just because it's water bodies, but it's a place where two water bodies intersect with each other. So it did hold great spiritual significance for them. Unfortunately, through the history of settlement, they were really, and the Mississaugas were hunter-gatherers who would often use the creek for fishing. And through the process of settlement, were really sort of forced from their traditional territory to a place and to a reserve that was not a traditional territory and didn't have any connection to the water. So they've lost that connection. And that was something that they talked about through our engagement with them. And that the possibility that this study and bringing not attention to it, but just understanding that through this study may provide an opportunity for them to potentially reestablish some connection to the water. So I think that's all I wanted to really highlight for our part of the project. I guess there's other more mechanical things I can talk about if people have questions about the project, which involved evaluating the site, creating a designation bylaw, actually having it designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, and then creating conservation guidelines based on Parks Canada standards and guidelines. I think those are, again, happy to discuss them, but I'd also be interested in any comments that the panel has about how we can bring different approaches to the place that we seek to conserve for everybody's benefit. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. I appreciate you taking that tack with your presentation. That's great. So fodder for discussion later. Next, we're going to have Ria Alamin presenting about the Brighter Days Ahead project. Ria?
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. I have a few images. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a brief on the Oculus. The South Humber Park Pavilion, located along the Humber River Trail, also known as the Oculus, is this wonderful modernist park pavilion, also called Space Age Park Pavilion. The Oculus was designed by architect Alan Crossley and engineer Lawrence Casali. It was built in 1959 in a time of ambition and optimism, and was also part of a generation of park pavilions that were built in the 50s and the 60s and can be found throughout the city's park system. Over the last few decades, however, the Oculus was suffering from neglect and deterioration and was even threatened by partial demolition. So in 2019, the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, the ACO, and JIMO received the Park People's Public Space Incubator grant to restore the pavilion and also reactivate it as a community hub through events and public engagement programs. However, due to the pandemic, the restoration was postponed from 2020 to 2021, or we were uncertain at the time when it was going to happen. But since the revitalization project was highly anticipated by the community and also due to the uncertainty of the pandemic and not knowing what's going to happen in the next year, we started thinking about a small temporary public art installation as a fun, uplifting gesture to keep the discussion and the engagement with the Oculus going with the community and the public. So in 2020, as you all know, we all relied on the outdoors to be active, to connect with each other, to connect with the community. So the installation, the idea of this installation actually responded to this as an opportunity to inspire, to provide a sense of optimism, to regenerate this amazing public space along the trail. And it's a really busy trail. A lot of people walk and cycle throughout the Humber River Trail. So this was a great opportunity to look at. And in terms of challenges, with limited resources and funding and also limited window of time, we relied on very simple design approach. We used simple application of vinyl strips that are very easy to remove without impacting the structure, and also potentially provide some protection during the winter to prevent further deterioration of the Oculus concrete roof. The design was inspired by the Oculus' original sense of optimism and whimsy, and the geometry of the design follows the actual geometry of the Oculus, the texture and the lines that radiate from the Oculus opening. And the result was this very simple but vibrant public art installation that mirrored the original intent of this wonderful pavilion, the fantastical and playful design intent. And this is where the title came from, Brighter Days Ahead. And we really enjoyed working on it. The entire office worked on this project as a team. So I'll leave some time for my colleague Stephanie to add a few things to tell you what happened after the installation.
Thanks, Surya. So this installation happened in October of 2020. And just an update since then, since we submitted this for the CAHP award, we're now actually going through the revitalization this past summer of July. And so it's been really wonderful getting to have this kind of initial public art installation there that we hadn't planned as part of the revitalization, because it kind of paved the way for us showcasing how this could be a place for programming and for public art that the community could use. Even though it was a restoration project that looked at, you know, the traditional parts of heritage restoration, so cleaning the stone and the repainting of the columns and refurbishing the flagstone, all of those things. A challenge with this project is just because we physically restore it doesn't mean that it won't just become derelict and abandoned again. It's important that it's useful and loved by the community. And so this was just a first step in showing how it could be used by the community for public art. And since then, we've seen lots of other public art at this site from other community members and artists who aren't ACO or JIMO. There's actually an art festival there just last week called See You Again Festival, where they had artists come to performances, they did movie screenings. And so we're excited to see that the revitalization has really been able to leverage existing infrastructure to be to show the value of heritage, but also for leveraging the social and cultural sustainability aspect of this project. So thanks, excited to share it with you all.
Wonderful, thank you both for that. Next up, we have Luke McAlpin, who's going to talk about his Master of Architecture thesis. Luke, you can take it away.
Thank you. And first, I want to thank Chris and all the organizers today. I'm really grateful to be here. It's very exciting. And especially among such wonderful projects. They're all incredible. Jason in particular, I love to see the capacity building in a conservation project. It's really great. Which kind of leads into my thesis, which is about those kinds of trade skill shortages. I was looking particularly at Toronto, and I looked at heritage policy and economic frameworks to try to understand why heritage tradespeople aren't seeing the same kind of growth and opportunity that seems to be available to heritage professionals. So really, in a way, the research is less about the trades work itself as it is about policy and the economic tools that the heritage sector has to support that trades work. And going through that, I found that there are tools that exist where sometimes we talk a lot about intangible heritage and how we don't have the kind of the structures for describing heritage value or the designation tools to make that kind of work a priority. In fact, there are tools available at policy levels in Toronto and also provincially and nationally to support heritage trades work, as well as some kind of economic tweaks, I guess, that could be made with the system as it stands. And so, of course, there were challenges with doing a thesis like this during a pandemic in isolation. I had wanted to reach out more to working tradespeople, and it's something I wasn't able to do. So that the thesis really doesn't have much to say about that trades work because we don't know much about it. We all are experiencing these trades shortages and everyone agrees that they're only getting worse. But in Canada, we don't have a way of measuring them and we don't know how to describe them properly or what we need to do to address them. So that's why I looked at these official publications and found that there too, tradespeople aren't represented in consultation for those documents very often. There are 2 national reports from the early 2000s that were specifically addressing skill shortages in heritage conservation. And since then, I haven't seen many that address that full community of people working in heritage. But of course, there are also opportunities. And I think over this past year, it's been really disruptive to the models that we've been using to fund heritage conservation and to describe the political relevance of conservation programs. So there's this amazing opportunity to decide as we move into a kind of a stimulus program post-pandemic, and we're dealing with the disruption to the tourism economy and the new rise in distributed work that makes investment in urban cores not, more or less what it was before, but maybe changes the way that we think about that. There's this amazing opportunity to rethink why heritage programs are important and to look at the kind of new ideas that are coming out in heritage, thinking about sustainable management of our built environment in particular. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luke. I think we'll circle back on that later for sure. I saw a lot of people nodding their heads. So before we open it up to everyone for more of a Q&A discussion, I'm wondering, Sarah, if I could get you to share some thoughts on the jury, just all of the different awards that you guys got to review this year. There was quite a diversity. And I should mention, I neglected to introduce Sarah properly earlier. She's Principal and Building Science Specialist at RDH Building Science. Sarah.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you to all the applicants. I think we have winners and applicants on the call today. On behalf of the judges and on behalf of Craig and Michael, who are our jury chairpersons, thank you to the applicants, obviously not only for the work that you put into the application and documentation itself that you submitted to CAHP, but certainly and most importantly for the good work and the hard work and the passionate work that you do in the field of heritage conservation, cultural heritage, all of those aspects of our field. So thank you. It was a quite lively discussion during our Saturday of jury deliberations. Of course, it's certainly difficult to select the winners and the merits versus the excellence and who gets an award and who doesn't, because certainly all projects have a tremendous amount of merit in their own right. So thanks to all of those. I think that the award of excellence and merit sort of kind of easily rose to the top for various reasons, and it's hard to just place one thing on various projects, but the presentations that were just given to us today highlight why those projects were felt by the jury to be award winning. They were place changing and community changing, the Brighter Days and the Windsor Library certainly revitalized not only the place, but became a social hub and brought a more derelict part of town or part of the park alive. So that's what really excited us. And certainly Jonathan's work at the Fort of Mississauga was so technical. I don't think that most people could understand it. And even I'm an engineer, and I thought that your award entry was like a lesson in masonry engineering. So thank you for the time in that. And certainly we did highlight a few of the other projects. We have our small and lovely category. And both of the projects, the Papineau Chapel in Quebec and the Silver Dollar Room in Toronto, were just that. They were small and lovely. You just want to hug them and, love them to bits. So those were great works. And certainly the Craftsman Award, I was honored to receive a Craftsman Award many, many years ago by CAHP. So, I just know the passion that the tradespersons, the heritage professionals, and the community put into those projects. And certainly the CCA Sculpture Garden in Montreal, although it's about 30 years, which doesn't seem old, is an important piece of the CCA and of Montreal. And to have seen a very considered approach, a very scientific approach placed on something that is important and has heritage value, but may not be old or historic in the sort of conventional sense was inspiring to show us how we can apply our principles to places and materials of all ages. So thanks again. I'll leave it at that. I want to leave it open for the Q&A and get some more lively discussion. I don't think you need to hear me lecture, but in closing, thanks again to all the applicants and certainly congratulations to our winners this year.
Great, thanks for that, Sarah. I really appreciate it. So now we can open it up. I'd encourage everyone that's able to turn on your camera, smile, wave. We can put your hand up for questions. You can just turn off your microphone and hope that you're the first one to speak up. You can use the chat if you'd like. I wonder, Michael or Craig, if you guys have any questions to get us started with based on your experience chairing the awards this year.
I don't necessarily have anything based on my experience in chairing the awards at the moment, because I've been very eager to ask Jason a question about the tradespeople who were trained in Windsor. I really want to know how that's going. Have they been working on other projects since? And I'm curious to know what Luke has to think about that as well.
You want me to answer first?
Sure.
It's actually been quite good. The students that had done the windows, obviously the windows were in such a bad shape that even if we were Dutchman geniuses, we wouldn't have been able to make that happen. So doing them from scratch actually proved quite fruitful because it taught them the reasons why certain joints are the way they are. Those students have gone on to start working. They've just started to work on another heritage project in which it isn't rebuild, it's actually rehabilitation of the windows. And so doing the windows from scratch gave them, I think, that key knowledge of fundamentally why were they built the way they were and how internal moisture is allowed to drain based on how those joints come together. I mean, I think that was sort of the key for them to understand. You have to think like water, and how do you get out when you're inside? So then the work to rehabilitate an existing window and, why you would use Abitron in a certain situation, why you wouldn't, how you do a Dutchman repair and the right way to do it, and that sort of thing became even more useful. I wish in our region there was still a much more vibrant, sense of reusing our existing contexts of our buildings. It is growing, but it has been a hard fought battle by many people, before my time. And we're starting to see the benefits of that. In terms of the masonry, those students have gone on and they have done at least another 2 schools in the area. So they, in our case, it was a lot more difficult than what they're doing now. They can find bagged mixes that work. In the case of what we did at this library, the sand was actually taken from site, and it was done, the buckets and the weighing and all that stuff. So they got the crash course in the hard way to do it, the testing, all that sort of thing. And now they've got those techniques and they're starting to use them. Now, is it as exciting as I want it to be? Of course, it's not as exuberant as I want, but it has reaped benefits.
Nice. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't have much more to say about it except that, but I think it's great. But it does kind of, one observation, it kind of shows up some of the things that we're sometimes reticent about from like a theoretical values point of view, that we don't like to imitate things, we don't like to copy things, and that if you're doing the work, the process of copying that heritage element or reproducing it is critical to going on and understanding when you see it. What are you looking at? How do you fix something that's just a little bit broken, doesn't have to be completely replaced? What is it doing? How does it function? And the value of that is really great.
I will say too that there was a lot of lessons learned, because in the process of learning how to do the windows, we were looking at how the windows were built in this instance, and I was explaining to them in the other projects that I had dealt with, other mechanisms that other historic windows had developed in terms of weather strippings and moving water out So it brought up a much larger discussion between how these techniques changed in different regions within North America, because they did change. I mean, they are different. And there's things which are universally similar. And I think that's something which is omitted in the trades today in many respects, because they're not building them from raw materials. So not a lot of times what we do is we specify a product. And so all the secrets of what makes that product is lost. And I think what is very unique to our rehabilitation approach is the fact that you have to go back into the headspace of the person that made it, understand the tools, and then understand in our current context, what is the right way, and I guess even the ethical way to deal with it. Those sort of things for a tradesperson to start to tackle goes far beyond the limited knowledge that they get in their trade. The breadth of that knowledge is really rich. And when they get the opportunity to do it, there's a joy in that they wouldn't have otherwise. And it's an appreciation for the soul that was put in to do it in the first place. And I think that's what sort of brings us the past and the present together, is the understanding of that continuity of the soul that goes in to make something what it is. And that's something which is unquantifiable. It's not something like embodied energy or anything like that. It's something totally different. And that's really a hard thing I can explain it till I'm blue in the face. It isn't until somebody actually physically gets involved in that process that they really understand it. And that's where I'm curious with your research, Luke, because that I think is, something that I think has yet to be quantified. We've had a lot of studies specifically with windows about, the energy efficiency of a heritage window compared to a modern window. And, we finally got to the point of realizing that, heck, there isn't much difference if you do it right? I mean, that's still something that's hard for us to get into the head of people that don't get it. But you can make a heritage window almost as efficient as a modern window. And it's a heck of a lot easier to fix, and will stick around a heck of a lot longer. Those sort of things are hard, but how do we make that sort of common in our understanding so that there is a desire to fix the darn thing and not just throw it away and lose all that embodied energy and skill, and as I say, soul that we can't rekindle.
Sure, and that's something that, so when I talk about not being able to, and regretting not being able to talk more to tradespersons when I was doing this research, is I did reach out, especially to the heritage trades programs at Algonquin. And when I was talking with people who are doing this work, one of the themes that came up was this idea that looking at heritage and evaluating heritage and deciding what to save and what to fix and what to replace was based on an understanding of honoring the work that went into it to begin with. And if you're not familiar with that work, it's hard to understand sometimes, I think, like viscerally what that feels, the soul of it. But it also ties really neatly into the kinds of conversations about resilience that people have been having, where it's exactly this. There's a similar performance, but one is much more resilient than the other. If we know how to make it, if we know how to fix it, then it can persist in a way, and it can as local communities, people can be much more independent of these huge supply chains and all of the issues that we're seeing coming up with that when something goes wrong.
It's Daryl Carey here. I couldn't figure out how to put up my hand. Yeah, I'm particularly really interested in the work Luke has been doing, and I was just trying to track down your email contact. You're not listed in the participants here, but I found you on LinkedIn. Here in Calgary, we've had, I would say, some real success in developing some heritage trades here. And what we talked about a lot is it's a way to preserve the intangible heritage that we talk about a lot. And there's some real world examples of this intangible heritage of the craftsmanship that's involved here. And Jason, you talked about the soul that goes into this work. There's one of the young carpenters who's working on our window rehabilitation program here. Every time I talk to him, he talks about how much fun he's having doing this kind of work. And I think that relates to what your comments about the soul that's in this work. So Luke, look for an email from me. I'm going to track you down.
Thank you.
It was almost ominous at the end there. Wonderful. I'm wondering if we can sort of switch gears, because I think we're now talking about, community benefit as well, right? With Jason doing training and stuff. So I'm wondering if we can sort of shift gears and talk about maybe the public process and community engagement in some of these projects. I know, Ellen, your project had a lot of community involvement, and I know Stephanie and Maria, I know that Brighter Days Ahead also had a very public face to it. I'm wondering if you might be willing to share some lessons learned or feedback from that process.
I actually add on to that a question for Ellen, just building on your comment, Chris. When we're talking about intangible heritage, I'm curious, Ellen, I really appreciate that you shared when talking about the project, sort of a different perspective, not just we did the conservation plan and we did the filled in this evaluation form and those things. And I'm curious to know if there was any important community social values that you identified through this public process that didn't quite fit the technical definitions in the Ontario Heritage Act, or that you had to fill out while doing the forms and all that stuff, and what those were, and how did you find a sneaky way of putting them into the strategy and arguing for them as cultural heritage, even if they didn't fit that technical definition?
Yeah, it's good question. First of all, the intangible is a really big issue. I'm interested to hear how people in the trades talk about intangible and the value that brings, because it's not the way we think about it in heritage planning. But the intangible, I would say a lot in our project was focused on the use, either historic uses or continuing uses. So I think the public engagement process had about 30 or 40 stakeholder groups. So everybody from the Mississaugas to the power boaters, the sailors, the paddle boarders, the swimmers, people who are using the area, which is a bit, we can tie to the Ontario Heritage Act, but is pretty difficult. I would have to give credit then to the town staff who were able to not shoehorn, but write a designation bylaw that contained those uses that did pass without opposition. Another thing I would say is that public engagement in our field in heritage planning is becoming, it has really it's changed dramatically, I would say, in the last 5 years. Our work is so much more transparent now, to the point where you are providing your work, your written work, to the community for them to comment on. So whether it's a statement, a designation bylaw draft, or an actual report, people really are scrutinizing your work to a degree that we haven't had or haven't experienced previously. So I find that interesting. And I also find it interesting the role that having public meetings, not in person, but through Zoom and other mechanisms, is very interesting, because I think we're getting a different crowd to public meetings than we did when they were only in person. So I think I've lost track of your comment as I went on a bit of a tirade there, but the public engagement, again, very huge component of our work. And the Heritage Act in Ontario is not really set up for cultural landscapes. It's not, we had to sort of use a combination of the Heritage Act, the policy statement, UNESCO definitions to define it and to have it designated. I will say that we benefited from the fact that all of the property within our cultural landscape, with the exception of one property, was owned by the town. So I think if you were looking at a cultural landscape that included many private property owners, it would have had a much harder time in actually creating a designation bylaw and having it passed without opposition.
Was that similar to the experience with the Oculus, like trying to, I mean, it's a very, secluded, but also very private or public area. did you find a lot of public scrutiny or a lot of input, a lot of passersby?
So the project actually started, the revitalization started through that public space incubator grant in 2019. But ACO got involved in the project because of the local community in 2016, reached out to us on social media because there were plans to partially demolish it. And so from the start, it's been a community-led initiative with people caring for it in sort of two diverse communities, one being just the local residents. There's been a lot of change in the demographic there in South Etobicoke and Toronto. If you're familiar with the area, there's been lots of new high-rise condos built in the past 5 years. So the demographics have really changed. And then there's also a lot of support from the community in terms of just the larger architecture heritage community. There's many people who are now advocating for modernism and space age architecture to be considered heritage, even if it doesn't have that old date stamp attached to it. So we found that people were very much engaged. We've had constant support and feedback, and things like the art installation were a way for us to have people share their thoughts on if they liked it, if they hated it, if it inspired them. And so those were all really important parts of the project. I don't know, Rhea, if there's anything you want to add.
I think that covers it all. I just wanted to say that we're still always surprised by the engagement we see with the space. Like it's amazing how a small intervention changes the way people see the space as a public, like a community hub to organize events or just walk by and stop to look at it, learn about it. We get a lot of questions now about the architecture of the Oculus and the history and restoration process. So it's just amazing to see that happening with a relatively small intervention.
I wonder, Jason, because you were dealing with a community gathering place, did you have similar experiences?
Yes, it was similar in the fact that the engagement was very intense. And that really helped us shape what we wanted to happen inside the building. That's why the building ends up having so many functions that it accommodates. And there was a lot of discussion about how people feel about the site prior to even, figuring out what to do with it. There was a lot of that discussion about, what is the current feeling of the site? What did they want to happen? What would make it part of the community again, where people would want to be there? It wasn't a place that people wanted to be. And I think that was something, really talked about. In addition, there was one surviving firefighter that we were able to bring into that discussion. And he was able to tell us what the place was like when it was in operation. And I think that also was very helpful in terms of everyone's understanding of how this was a vibrant place. The fire station was a place everybody sort of came to because the doors were always open and people would stroll by, and it was a place of casual discussion and children would come in. So that is what really impacted specifically that piazza space in the front. Because at the time when we started working on it, it was so overgrown and there was large trees in the way and it became almost fortress-like. But that reshaping of the front, that street facade, the way it engaged into the urban context, changed how people would come to the building. It's at the point now where even during the pandemic, so I was just this there the other day, and one of the librarians is like, there's a homeless person who comes here every day and cleans up the front and feels like that's his way of maintaining the space. And so I really believe that it is that kind of engagement that's really necessary to make a space vibrant. Like Rhea is saying, it didn't take much to make that space come back to life again. And I think those are those sort of intangibles that as designers, we can bring to a space, and something that didn't feel like it was inviting or welcome. All of a sudden you give it that little spark, and all of a sudden everyone wants to come to that place.
A great example of a community really taking ownership and caretaking. Open it up, see if there's any questions. I don't want to monopolize the questions. But if no one's jumping up, Jonathan, I wonder if you could share some of your experiences, because you guys really took a very minimalist approach when the original proposal was quite invasive, if I can, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties I had with the initial approach was that it would really make it hard for a future engineer to get any sense of the space or to see the underlying masonry without removing the shoring, which would be risky, right, without understanding it. So I sort of felt like it was, you know, once you do that, it's hard to go backwards and take that shoring out, and you're really relying on, engineers are fairly conservative, I think, by nature. If you don't understand something, you're going to be more conservative. And if you take away the opportunities for a future engineer to understand it, you're really condemning it to probably rebuilding. I said to the Parks Canada guys, you're going to wait between 500 and 500 years for the building to fall down onto the shoring, and then what? So I felt like that was, before proceeding with any kind of value engineering of that shoring or whatever assumptions were baked into that project, it was really necessary to go back to the first principles and first back to square one and see what needed to be done. And then, yeah, I mean, maybe it's a safe bet to put shoring in, but I felt like if we could, the building would now be protected from water infiltration with the roof, and it may still be shifting and drying. It's going to take a long time for that masonry to dry. It's still in an unheated space, but at least it's protected now, and it's fully accessible to for a future engineer to evaluate whatever follow-up repairs are needed. But it's a 3-foot thick arch, so there's a lot of room to give on it. So I think we were pretty comfortable overall, and we got the shoring budget fully reallocated to I think bring value to the overall project at the end. So.
And just to add to that, Jonathan, like as a structural engineer myself, I really do appreciate the kind of great length you went to in analyzing the arch and very much detail and doing the research on site to fully understand the cross section, the thickness, the geometry, and in the end, like you're saying, to save, you know, and not to put this shoring in that doesn't seem like is really necessary when it comes down to it, and using those funds for areas of the structure that was required. The one question I was just curious about is what stopped. So there was an original shoring design, and why didn't that go forward at that time? Do you know? Or
oh, it exceeded the budget.
Okay.
It was so expensive that it exceeded the budget, and so that's why it was put out to different consultants to value engineer the shoring in order for it to fit into the budget. So, and then we got that budget reallocated, like I say, which was, I think, I'm glad they were able to do that, because a lot of the areas that we dealt with in terms of the masonry would have no longer been accessible because with this new roof. The new roof was intended to go on in the original project, and it did ultimately go on. That's the right decision in my view. And there was a historical precedent for a roof that I don't think the initial building the initial fort would not have had a roof on it that prevents you from firing cannons off the top of it. But there was a historical precedent for a roof that covered the tops of the walls and protected them. So, but all that legwork was done prior to the consultant team that I was on, prior to our involvement. So, but that roof, then, you know, a lot of that masonry was no longer accessible once that roof is in place. So, good to be able to get it done as part of this project. And then, you know, that this is not a complete. There will be a future project necessary at that site. We did not get down to the lower levels. We tailored the work to fit the budget that was available. So.
I loved your analysis of the dome. I thought of the Plenty analysis of the Dome of St. Peter's, where they did the hanging chain and then they fit the geometry in. But to see that you know, that it's almost like looking at a reinforced concrete beam where you're trying to figure out where you're going to get tension and compression. I think it was brilliant. So to think first about the building and then find an engineering solution to justify it, I mean, that's a stroke of genius.
Yeah, it was, well, and I did do a fair bit of research myself, just to make sure I was on the right track with that. And yeah, it's funny, arches are all geometry. The stresses are not, unlike steel or concrete beams where stress levels are, you know, like that's what you're looking for. The scale of buildings is such that arches are generally not going to fail. And I mean, we checked it anyway, just to say we did, but the stress levels are low. So yeah, it's all geometry. And if you can draw that line within the arch, you're good to go.
So was it an FEA analysis in the end, or was it just geometric analysis?
No, geometric.
Wow.
Yeah, we did a couple. We did the geometric is the one that I felt the most comfortable with. And FEA, you've got, I mean, it's linear elastic, right? So you end up with, it's hard to, you can't look at it the same way.
That's great. It's a really good example of how the research that you do to inform your project. I mean, in the end, you ended up being more cost efficient and then having a minimal intervention approach, which is great. I think that sort of ran across all of the award winners this year. We had that sort of theme of the really good background research, really good evidence-based decision-making for all of our projects. So I think that's, maybe we can talk about that if there's lessons learned about the evidence gathering phase or the evaluation and research phase. I wonder if any of the panelists would want to weigh in on just the importance of background research in these specific projects. Or any of the award winners that just happen to be on the call today. Because I think that's something we often overlook when we're talking about like the actual intervention and the actual planning. We don't always sit and talk about, you know, how did we find this information? How did we sift through the information? How did we base our decisions? No one wants to jump in.
I can jump in a bit about Oculus, but it's a bit about the revitalization in general. But a reason that led us to do things like public art as a form of heritage awareness and engagement was because we looked into the history of not just why it was built and all those archive photos that Ria shared, but also we looked into the history of what changed in the context over the decades that led to it becoming derelict. And understanding how it became derelict was essentially in us understanding how we can ensure that doesn't happen again. And part of that was the awareness factor of people. One of the most common questions we got when we were doing this project on site was people would just come up and say, what's a park pavilion? What is this? And we realized that was an element of how it wasn't being used because people didn't understand how it could be used or what it was or why it was here. So that led to then things like that art installation where we realized we needed, you know, just having a sign and a board or a plaque explaining all this wasn't going to be engaging enough. Something that was an art installation that was bold and fun would spark people's curiosity, and then they would learn that, and then that would ideally lead to it continuing to be a place for the community.
On sort of a similar vein, your project had to do with a site that had a very specific, very accepted historical narrative attached to it. As you know, a founding harbor, there was sort of overtones of commercial and maybe military history to it, and it was a very, very, for lack of a better word, traditional story. I wonder if your work uncovered different aspects that you were able to weave through the policy.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll have to say, I mean, my training is as a historian. So the question about how much research to do to me is just, it's not like we always do a ton of research at the front end because we think that's just the basis of good decision making. But one of the things, again, that I think is a potential for looking at places as cultural landscapes is to unweave that narrative that has been established about places with boundaries that have been created maybe for reasons of administration or bureaucracy, like the park is this component and there's another park over here and this is this. So when we got the project, the city had really thought about it as, I think, 3 or 4 different cultural landscapes. And we never thought that would be the outcome of our project, but we did for East Harbor, the West Harbor, because they both had these different narratives associated with them. The West Harbor was a site of industry, workers' housing. The East Harbor was more, had shipbuilders living there, was like a different class. And so we thought about that a lot. And do we do 2 landscapes? Is it 1? And ultimately, we said 1 for a variety of reasons, not just historic, because what's the point in dividing a harbor in half? You can't really do that. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So to bringing those back together, but also for reasons of like biodiversity, like Mark Laird, who I mentioned earlier, would talk about, like, the birds don't know if they're in a heritage conservation district or in their east or the west or whatever. So he really brought a perspective to the project that I thought was fantastic, to talk about biodiversity. And we were able to integrate our project with Oakville's biodiversity strategy, which again, I think is quite progressive. So yeah, through the research and just through thinking about places more in their entirety, as opposed to how we have just somehow come to define them through these boundaries that are they're not fake, but they've been invented for our own purposes. So I think that that's a potential for cultural landscapes. And again, something that just, I gotta tell you, we love doing the research. So we would just do research forever. But definitely based on the research and the project team looking at things in their entirety, I really think helped the project in the end.
Thanks, Ellen. I see a raised hand. John, did you have a question, a comment?
Well, actually, a few comments. One is working on the CCA. I mean, most of the buildings I've worked on, the designers were dead. And here we have the opportunity to have the designer there and asking, namely Phyllis Lambert and Peter Rose, and asking them, what if we're replacing the windows, what do you want us to replace them exactly the same? And we realized that, like us, designers are very practical. And so often when we do research, we start looking at, okay, well, there was some great intention here, so we have to respect that. Let's see what other designers were doing at the time. So it's really a question of, and this really opened my eyes to the way that things are. I mean, I usually do extensive research, as the whole office does, and looking at precedents, looking what was happening at the same time, looking at other works by the architect. But it's really interesting to have the architect there and really see over time how their understanding of the building and what they did even just 30 years ago, what's important to them after having lived with the building and what is less important. So I think it's important for us to, when we're doing this type of research, to ask ourselves questions and perhaps not just run into and try and follow processes. The second thing is, I had the privilege of also working on the Calgary City Hall with a really interesting team. And, in conservation, we often talk about compatibility. And we have in Calgary this wonderful stone, which I fell in love with, called the Paskapoo sandstone, which has this unique color and texture, but it's also not a very durable stone. So in the context of trying to be compatible physically, mechanically with a stone which is not of high performance, how do you deal with that? And so with the client and with the entire team, we looked at sourcing the stone, and we ended up finding stones. Paskapoo is no longer quarried. We also went through an extensive exercise to try and find other deposits and areas where we could extract the Paskapoo, but we could not do that in time to meet the project schedule. So we went out on the city's suggestion to a bid to try and find suppliers, and we received stones from Spain and from Germany, and we ended up choosing a variety of stones and maintaining the Paskapoo and creating details that would protect the Paskapoo. The Paskapoo, like many other materials, work very well when they're protected from water. But it's just the whole notion of understanding what compatibility is, putting it in context and having a wider understanding of, and even openness as to what could be potential solutions. So these two projects really challenged my way of looking at conservation projects.
I think that is a great example of what diverse projects we had and what creative solutions and innovations and don't know. Michael and Craig, I'm going to pick on you just before we're closing here to see if you have any just sort of closing thoughts, because we had really great, just a great batch of nominations, a great batch of award winners, and there was such diversity that I wonder if you have some takeaways from this year's awards process.
Well, I was just gonna echo some of, kind of in closing, to echo some of the points that Sarah was saying, and take this opportunity just to thank everyone for all these submissions that come through. Like, I think we had 22 submissions, and there's a lot of work and effort and time to put together all the content and the material, and there's a lot of effort, and we really do appreciate it. And I think we had great success this year, and looking forward obviously to next year. And also just again, another special thanks to the jury members. There's a lot of work involved to review all the submissions and spending a whole Saturday with us discussing back and forth. Really do appreciate it. And if anyone is interested in being part of the jury for 2022, please let us know. Yep.
Yeah, I've been on the awards committee now for I think about 4 years, and for the whole time we've been working to expand our awards program beyond major architectural projects on public monuments, which in past years has been the major theme of the awards. And we're still debating how to do that, but looking at the projects that we received this year and the awards that were given out, I think without our doing anything, we've really managed to get a much greater diversity of projects. And I'm really pleased with, that one of the ones we didn't talk about today, for example, was the Silver Dollar Room, which is an interior of a music venue that was salvaged and reinstalled in a completely new building. And it's that, and many of the other ones we have talked about today are completely different types of projects than we've had in the past. And I'm excited about it, and I'm excited about what it says about heritage practice in Canada. And I think next year's awards are going to be even more exciting.
Thanks for that. So once again, thanks to our panelists, our participants, and I just want to once again offer our sincerest congratulations to all of our 2021 winners. And we'll be showing them again at the AGM, and congratulations, and thank you all for coming to this session. We really appreciate it. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Night.